Hello, I know it's a long weekend. Thanks for getting up and tuning in. A very good morning to you and welcome to another exciting edition of your favorite program, Media Monitor, right here on the SABC News Channel, Africa's news leader. Now, we're broadcasting live, as we always do, from our studios in Auckland Park in Johannesburg. And here's a look at what we have for you this morning. First of all, we're going to be taking a look at the new regulations for data bundles that were recently announced by ICASA to govern the data usage. Good news for consumers, but perhaps not totally, but we'll find out what that means. We also speak to the award-winning former journalist Tracy Mackey, who's been bestowed the Order of Ikamanga by President Cyril Ramaphosa for her contribution to journalism. And lastly, we carry on with our interview and our story that we've been tracking since last week, and that's Centec on the issues facing community radio sector. So all of that still to come on the program. Stay right where you are. But first, let's take a sneak peek at what's in our Sunday papers and what the headlines the papers are running. The Sunday Times, well, that's leading with how the South African government is planning to lobby other African countries as it prepares to wage war against the International Association of Athletics Federations over what critics are calling an unjust attempt to clip the wings of South Africa's Caster Semenya. The City Press is running with a story on how the crisis-ridden VBS Mutual Bank lent out large sums of money to its own directors, municipal officials and SA Municipal Workers Union, SAMU, to finance building finance a building that the union already owned. According to the publication, at least 5 of VBS's senior executives received mortgage loans running into millions of rands between 2015 and last year. And the Sunday Independent is leading with a story about how the fight against the data costs looks set to escalate, despite Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, ICASA, ordering network operators to no longer snatch unused data from consumers once it's expired. Well, the Sunday Tribune, that's leading with how mafia-style illegal sand miners have been operating under the noses of Dube Trade Port and government officials on the banks of the Mdloti River in KwaZulu-Natal North Coast. The Sunday Argus is running a story about how it's almost midway into the academic year and some students who are eligible for free education have not received allowances for accommodation, transport as well as meals. Now, crossing our borders in Swaziland, the Observer there, the Sunday Observer, is leading with a story about a civil servant who's been arrested following his involvement in a gruesome murder of High Court prosecutor Stanley Dlamini of Beginkosi, who was allegedly stoned in the head with a brick twice in the wee hours of yesterday morning. And moving to West Africa, Nigeria's Daily Trust is running with a story about the People's Democratic Party, which has started the process of identifying a candidate that can give President Muhammadu Buhari a run for his money in the 2019 presidential elections. Okay, so those are the front pages of your newspapers, and we'll take another look at those, particularly the ones here in South Africa, a little bit later on. Now, the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, ICASA, has announced a new set of regulations to govern the rules on mobile data expiry and out-of-bundle billing earlier this week. And to talk to us about that a little bit more is the ICASA Councillor, Butlanyana Mugele. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for having me on the show.
All right, so some relief for us as consumers. I mean, I certainly enjoy the idea that my data is not going to disappear. But let's talk about the big one. Hashtag Data Must Fall has been a campaign that's been running for a long time, and you didn't announce that data costs are going to decrease. Why not?
You know, I think maybe we need to put the regulations into perspective. It's just one of the many programs that we are undertaking around the cost to communicate. It's a first phase, if you will, to deal with data costs. There's a process running parallel to determine markets and then also to regulate pricing. You would appreciate that ICASA is an administrative body. We are governed by certain laws in terms of how you deal with competition matters. So you really need to go through a thorough, well-considered process before you can pronounce on pricing. And that's why it's taking so long. But because as a regulator, we do things in the public interest, we decided to take a programmatic approach where you will deal with low-hanging fruits, and in this instance was data expiry rules and out-of-bundle pricing. So the next phase then will deal in detail with pricing issues, and you must also bear in mind that we have to have a sustainable and long-term solution in place. So that's why it's taking so long, but we're working behind the scenes to ensure that around this time next year, we are able to pronounce on data pricing.
All right, so let's talk about data pricing. You know, as consumers, we believe everything is expensive and everything costs a lot. Is that a fair assessment when we start comparing with the rest of the world? Is South African data costs, are they high?
It depends on which source you use. And precisely because of that, ICASA did its own study to have a realistic benchmark. And one of the things that we found was that we're actually the 6th cheapest in SADC. Botswana has the highest, we're cheaper than Zimbabwe. But having said that, you know, I mean, cost is relative to the person that has to pop up the money to pay. So relatively speaking, in terms of SADC, in terms of BRICS and internationally, we're fairly competitive. However, I think we still need to intervene in as far as pricing is concerned, that it's affordable to the South African consumer. I think it has to do with the person that has to pay the money, rather than how we compare with other countries.
So if the mobile operators are not colluding, then isn't it that market forces determine the price, and that's what it costs?
It's a bit of a difficult one. Because I think it's in the nature of business people to maximize profit and to use whatever strategies that will work for them. I also think that it's the responsibility of the regulator to make sure that prices are regulated in the interest of consumers, but it has to be done in a way that the businesses that actually provide the services are sustainable. And I guess I'm not really answering your question in as far as you're expecting me to say. But yeah, I think that's in the final analysis, that's the issue. Sometimes market forces don't do things in the interest of the consumer.
So you have to intervene.
So you have to intervene.
All right, so these interventions that you did announce this past week, so out of bundle rates, you have to opt in.
Yes.
Because those rates were enormously different from your bundle rates.
Yes.
What does that mean for the consumer then?
I think, to put it in simplistic terms, that people perceive data as disappearing, and they perceive data as eating up their airtime. So in the final analysis, that's what's not going to happen anymore. Because then, firstly, providers are required to give notifications. So as your data depletes, you become aware of it. And then secondly, before you can be defaulted to out-of-bundle rates, which then eats into your airtime, you would then have to give your consent. You either give consent to be cut off and then you recharge again, or consent to be charged out of bundle rates. But I think the biggest win of them all is the fact that data won't expire, which means that if you are an active user of your SIM, you're able to roll over data, and you can also share your data with other users on the same network.
Will it never expire, or are there limits to this? Because, you know, I might go away for a year.
Okay.
And do I come back and find my data waiting for me, or what happens?
I think, look, there are a number of factors that will determine whether or not it expires, but the way that the regulation is crafted is such that it doesn't expire. But I think the onus then becomes on the user to remain active in the network and to roll over the data.
All right, okay, final question. How long do you think this data cost study is going to take? When might we get an announcement from ICASA?
I'm anticipating next year around this time, and I'm doing so taking into account the nature of the processes of ICASA. We are a public body, so we have to consult in everything. So far, what we've done is that we've consulted on what constitutes markets that we should regulate. We're expecting to get feedback from stakeholders in May. In June, we should be able to pronounce on the markets. After the markets have been pronounced on, then we start the process of an inquiry. So the research and the background work has already been done.
All right.
What needs to then kick in will be a public consultative process, which can be lengthy depending on the strategies that you use. Right. I think it's important as ICASA to be as transparent as possible. So chances are there will be a document that goes out for public input, and as per law, you need at least 45 days for people to respond. You need to then have public hearings and the like. So,
okay, so bottom line, we've got at least a year.
Yeah.
All right, we've run out of time, but a little bit later on, we're going to have a discussion about community radio, and more than 100 of the 200 plus stations are not able to pay their fees to Centec. So they're struggling. And a question for you is, are you just handing out licenses willy-nilly to community radio when perhaps they're not viable?
Not necessarily. I think financial viability is one of the main considerations. Actually, when people make applications, they have to indicate realistic projected cash flow and operational costs. I think that the issue with this sector has to do with governance and management. It's actually quite broader than affordability of signal distribution costs. The fact that people aren't able to afford signal distribution costs indicate that there's probably problems in the management and the financial management of the sector. But the long and short of it, financial viability is one of our main considerations when we decide to grant a license. Having said that, I think there is still room for us to make our selection process more robust. And the new framework that we have published the draft framework that we published last week, actually goes to the heart of that. We're trying to make the filters a bit more tighter.
Okay, but then Nana, thank you very much. Always a pleasure to talk to you. And I hope that the next time we talk, you give us more good news about data usage and so on and so forth. But thanks so much for coming in on a Sunday morning. Thank you for your time.
Then. Thank you.
All right, okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll introduce to you someone who won an order, special order, Ikamanga, from President Ramaphosa yesterday, and find out why she was recognized in this way.
SABCnews.com is your one-stop digital portal to all the news you need. With a website that is easy to use on mobile, SABC News prides itself in being the primary source of public service content across multiple platforms. Watch live streams of all the big news events on the SABC News YouTube channel, which is one of the most viewed South African YouTube channels globally. And catch up on the best of SABC television and radio news. Follow breaking news on all of the SABC News social media platforms Interact with SABC News on Facebook and stay connected on Twitter for the latest headlines and real-time updates by our reporters. SABC News, everywhere.
Welcome back. You're watching Media Monitor. Now, yesterday, President Cyril Ramaphosa bestowed national orders on a select group of people who have excelled in different ways. Champions of freedom, peace, human rights, social justice and equality. The ceremony took place at the Presidential Guest House in Pretoria, and our guest this morning, Tracy Mackey, was among those honoured.
The Order of Ikamanga in bronze is awarded to Ms. Tracy Mackey for her contribution to the field of journalism and exposing the evils of apartheid. She exposed the covering up of the manner Steve Biko's death was reported and exposed those in the security branch who were involved.
So that was Tracy Mackey getting her Order of Ikamanga yesterday in bronze. And she joins us in studio now. Tracy, thanks very much for joining us and congratulations. Well done. Was it a surprise?
It was. It was indeed a surprise. One is nominated and a staff member had nominated me, but that was in August last year. So one tends to forget and suddenly one receives a letter from the presidency advising one that the president has accepted your nomination, which is indeed an honor and very humbling. I think humbling is more important than anything else.
I suppose people will remember certain pieces of work that you did, but in the end, actually, it was a whole career of work and body of work. But take us back to that time when you were a journalist and this outing of Gideon Nieuwoudt and his involvement in the passing of Steve Biko. Tell us about the story and how it came about and how you were able to crack the code, as it were.
Obviously, after 1994, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had been established, and people involved in apartheid crimes were applying for amnesty. I was a journalist then in the Eastern Cape at the Herald and the Weekend Post. I had grown up in King Williamstown, so Steve Biko had been an icon from when I was a little girl of 11 years old, and I remember his funeral in King Williamstown at the Victoria Grounds. So he had always been I was totally intrigued by Steve Biko. During the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, people were wondering within the industry, the media industry, if the perpetrators and who had been involved in his death were going to apply for amnesty. So the big question was, were Biko's killers going to apply for amnesty? Obviously, over the years, he died in the 70s and 1994, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 1996. I had heard, and I had been tipped off by an informant that they were going to apply, that Gideon Nieuwoudt, who was notoriously involved in apartheid crimes, was going to apply for the death of Matthew Ganiwe, and I had been harassing him. And in those days, I wasn't even 5 foot, and I was certainly a lot smaller than I am now, width-wise. And And he was almost the hunted. He had become the hunted. The hunter had suddenly become the hunted. Even this tiny little journalist upset him, and I had been hassling him, much to what he had done to us over the years for the death of Matthew Ganiwe. And one morning, we didn't have a lead on the Weekend Post. It was a Saturday morning, and I thought, well, let me just try Gideon Nieuwoudt. And in a moment of weakness and absolute anger, and I think it came about over those weeks and weeks of harassment by me as a journalist, asking the same question, were you involved in the death of Matthew Ganiwe? He broke down and he said, I'm telling you, I was never involved in Matthew Ganiwe. I did Biko. And I said, I beg your pardon, are you telling me you were involved in Steve Biko's death? And I said, may I interview you about that? Unfortunately, I was on the desk that day and I couldn't actually go to the airport. He was flying out and he had agreed to speak to me, and we sent a journalist who collected additional information. But yeah, and I think, Peter, the most important person is, I might have been the journalist, but you know, the people, the brave people who actually deserve the awards are the newsmakers. It's the Steve Bikos, it's the Simphiwe Mthimkhulus who he was involved in. Really, it's the people we write about, we talk about. They're the award winners.
So a little bit later on, we're going to be talking about press freedom, and I just wonder what it was like being a journalist pre-1994. And, you know, we've heard these revelations of Stratcom and planting journalists in newsrooms and having informants in the system there. What was it like working for the Herald in PE back in those days, pre-1994, with this government that had an agenda?
Peter, I was 18 years old when I became a cub reporter. I worked at the Daily Dispatch. It was an absolute hotspot. I worked in King Williamstown on a community newspaper. And harassment by journalists was very real. The fact that there were people planted within the industry and in newsrooms was also very real. The fact that our telephones were tapped in those days, we didn't have cell phones, was very real. We had state of emergency, so although one saw police brutality, one couldn't report about it. So we were handcuffed, we were gagged, and we couldn't tell the stories. So freedom of speech and the freedom of the press that we have today should never be taken for granted, because we know what it was like living in an environment where it wasn't there. And it was heartbreaking. You know, at the end of the day, most people had studied at university. I didn't have the means to study at university. For a young person of 18 to suddenly be harassed by security policemen, I didn't even know what a left-winger was.
Were you at times in fear? Were you threatened at any time? Did you do your job and think, my goodness, you know, this is actually quite dangerous what I'm doing?
You know, in all the years of journalism, I was never, ever afraid. Whether I was reporting on apartheid crimes in the early 80s, the only time I was ever afraid was when I reported about a casino in Port Elizabeth, where they were obviously making a lot of money, but kids were being left in the car outside in the car park, and we headlined the story Casino Orphans. And I don't know why, but that was a story that actually I was afraid. I was afraid to go home to my flat at night. But other than that, no. You're on an adrenaline hype. You just want to get there, do the story. Chris Hani assassination. I was in New Brighton. I drove a tiny little red Uno. My car was stoned. And you don't think of your own life. I think maybe that's why I left journalism. It's when I had children.
Right. Well, you're going to stay with us, and we're going to start looking at the newspapers and to have that discussion about press freedom a little bit later on. But thanks so much indeed, and once again, congratulations on being honoured by the President yesterday. Well done.
Thank you so much.
All right, okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll start looking at the papers and also what's been happening on the digital space. Stay with us, you're watching Media Monitor.
This is your midday report. Good afternoon.
I will be faithful.
I assume as President of the Republic of Kenya.
Let's take a look at how African markets and currencies are performing now.
The central bankers say the success of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies is just a bubble.
Breaking stories, detailed economy and sport. Tune into Midday Report every Monday to Friday from 12 p.m.
Right, if you're just waking up and enjoying your long weekend, welcome. You're watching Media Monitor, and as we do often on this program, is we take a look at what's happening in our newspapers, what's making headlines. Right now, we're now joined by Amy McGill, who's the editor of the Randburg Sun, and I used to live in Randburg for a while, so this is a paper that I know quite well. Amy, thanks very much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So, one of the things that we are going to be talking about later on is community radio, but community media generally is quite important, and the Randburg Sun fits into that quite a bit. Tell us about your publication and the importance of having community newspapers.
So the Randburg Sun, it's one of Caxton's biggest newspapers and also one of Caxton's oldest newspapers. We distribute to, I think, about 60,000 households. And what's important about the Randburg Sun and what's important about community journalism is that it brings news home. It brings news, you know, in a world of globalization, people have access to endless information, access to endless causes. They can be part of any cause that they choose to. But in the end, people come to the comfort of their homes, and that is what community media gives them. It's that comfort, it's that being able to help your next door neighbor, to know what's going on in the lives of the people around you, and being able to affect change in an immediate surrounding where you can see that change being affected.
So typically, what kind of stories, when you're sitting as editor and you're talking to your reporters, what kind of stories are you telling them to look for? I mean, I lived in Windsor East for quite a while, and, you know, that area's changed a lot, you know, and it's quite sad to see some of the things that are going on there.
Degradation,
So is it these kinds of stories that you monitor, and what are you telling your...
So we have two different ways of looking at it. We run our websites as well, and those are obviously more focused on breaking news, on the big hard news stories, on the evictions and the metro news and that kind of thing. And then we have our newspapers where we try to focus more on the person, on the people affected by those stories. So yes, we had mass evictions in Windsor a week ago, but for our newspapers, we will try to find the child who was in the photograph that we took sitting bewildered at what was going on, and we'll try to speak to their family and to the people who were literally left on the streets because of what happened. It's more of that, again, that bringing it home, that finding the person within the story.
All right. Before we start looking with you and Tracy on the main papers, last question in terms of community. So we're going social, we're going digital. Are you finding that the print version is starting to disappear, or what's the story?
I don't believe that print will ever disappear.
Yeah.
I think that it's people like the feeling of a newspaper in their hands, and it almost has more legitimacy. You know, once it's in the newspaper, it's real. You know, online it's breaking, and it's so fast-paced, and our communities understand that when it's fast-paced, the information changes. But by the time it gets to the newspapers, they know that that is solid. That is the information that you can take as absolutely 100% factual.
All right, okay. Let's take a look at the newspapers. And earlier on, we sort of showed our viewers what the headline stories were. But perhaps let me start with you, Tracy. Is there anything that's on the front pages that sort of caught your attention straight away? And there's a number of different stories this weekend. Often, they kind of all pick the same headline. But when you look at this weekend's papers, they're all kind of got their own different one, haven't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The City Press leads with how Busi saved Ace, a story about the public protector allegedly covering up the Frida Dairy project, which is obviously hot news, especially given Ace's position in the ANC, the top six. The Independent Sunday Independent has a strap across the top with the award winners, and it was really an array of everybody. And then, so definitely a bouquet of very many different stories. Sunday Times, Furious SA fights for Super Castor. So exciting headlines.
Sunday Times, Castor Semenya. I mean, this is an enormous story, and it does seem as if, you know, we will get emotional. Yes. We will get, because she's our own, she's our Castor.
Our golden girl.
And so everything against her is kind of, you know, is there an argument for what the IAAF is putting forward? What the article sort of spoke to me is that they didn't do a great job of trying to get to the solution.
Of the investigation. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I can understand what they're saying if there is an unfair advantage, but it is the way that she was born, you know, and to say that she now needs to go through medical procedures to adjust the way that she was born it's so completely sexist, and it's wrong on so many levels. This clause that they're putting in now that says that that women who are born with naturally high occurring levels of testosterone in their systems will have to medically reduce it. They're not doing the same to men. Men are not having to have their levels of testosterone checked, and they're not having to have their levels brought down medically. So it is so completely sexist. And while I agree if there is an unfair advantage, it shouldn't be happening, there should also be another way of handling the situation.
Tracy, they've definitely, I mean, you know, there's scientists saying there that the science that they've used and the evidence that they've put forward isn't all that compelling. But I just wonder, as a journalist, are we telling the story properly and fairly, or are we getting caught up in the emotional roller coaster that is supporting Castor no matter what?
Well, there are two sides to every story. Yeah. However, I think following on by what you said about community news, people tell stories. We tell our stories through people. If you can put a face and a personality to a story, and that's how we distribute our news, that's how we tell the stories. Castor also represents so many other incidents where this has happened. And I just think the IAAF obviously needs to get their story right. They need to, every scientific test needs to be done. But more importantly, you know, if the shoe was on the other foot, you know, we're not sending, and I think again it's a sexist, we're not sending men sportsmen off to be checked. Yeah. You know, it's a little bit of a hypothetical argument, but, you know, and we need, as South Africans at the moment, so divided, we need Castor Semenya's. We need to fight for causes for Castor Semenya. And no matter where it goes, we need to be behind her and we need to fight for her. So maybe I'm a little bit biased. Maybe I've been out of the industry for a bit too long. But yes, I think that we need to make sure that Castor gets a fair deal. So
let's go back to the City Press, because this story about Advocate Busisiwe Mkhwebane, the public protector, it's one of those kind of stories where the victors and the vanquished are now being measured post-Nasrec last year. So those that seem to have been close to President Jacob Zuma are coming up on the other side of the equation now. And there were suggestions that if this is true, that she didn't follow through with the Tulima Donsela's recommendations on the Frida Farm, that's quite an indictment for a sitting public protector, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think we're in a space politically where there is a cleanup. Allegations need to be properly investigated. I think we're in a space where, as a nation, we feel they are being properly investigated. And I think we need to give the law space to take its course. I was listening to the president on SABC News about the Northwest. You know, it's not for a new president to come in and suddenly fire everybody willy-nilly. You know, everything has got to be, he would be irresponsible if he did that. So no matter what it is, I think where we've maybe erred in the past, now we need to actually ensure that it's investigated properly. We need to give justice its space to carry out proper investigations. And who's wrong? Heads must fall. It's as simple as that.
Okay. All right, ladies, we're going to chat again in a short while, press freedom and also what's happening in the week ahead. But in the meantime, I think it's an opportunity for us to take a look at what's been happening on social media, because, of course, young people hardly pick up actual newspapers anymore. Most of their news is happening on social media, Twitter, Snapchat, you name it. There's always one coming up every week. And Bukule Putini is one of our SABC digital news producers. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, so let's start with kind of what's trending, what's been happening, what's the big story this weekend?
As usual, Peter, the week has been busy. From your Caster Semenyas to your Makosikosa Freedom Day, the Mahikeng protest, but this morning at the top of the top 5 hashtags we have RIP Akumzi. So we start with sad news this morning where Akumzi Jezile and his friends, and 2 of them are also in the media industry, Siasanga Kobese and Tobani Mseleni, died in a car accident near Queenstown. The first tweet says, "Rest in peace, brother, you were such an inspiration, RIP Akumzi Jezile." And people have been showing sadness, and one says, Sunabile says, "This is so sad, Madoda, your condolences to the family, his friends, his colleagues, Maba Ola Akuhlanga Lungehlanga, be strong, Bandagwete, RIP Akumzi." So, and the last tweet says, "I actually didn't want to tweet about Akumzi's passing till I was super sure, because a seed of hope in me was praying he's still with us. Now it's real, he's gone, and I dread this life thing. One day you here, the next you gone. It's a scary thought. RIP God's angels."
And you know what's scary about these kinds of things now is that you can be on social media literally the day before, the morning of your accident, and at 29, you know, it's such a shock because he's so young.
They were all young. They were all young, and they were making moves within the media industry. We have lost.
All right. But there was also sport, wasn't there? And,
which was exciting, yes.
We're not so excited because our teams didn't win.
Yes.
But the Brazilians.
Let's not be biased, but Sundowns fans are happy, and they are celebrating their 8th Premiership League win. So yesterday they played against Ajax Cape Town, and they won the Absa League Premiership. And people praised their coach, Pitso, saying, "Pitso Jingles Musimane, a former player who's now the best coach in South Africa. Pitso has changed the landscape of South African football, winning 1 CAF, 3 Absa Premierships, 2 Nedbank Cups, 1 Super 8 and 1 Telkom Cup. 3 league titles in 5 seasons, shows consistency. Hail Pitso."
Wow.
Yes, yes, and the next tweet says...
So clearly, we got lots of social media traffic on this one, eh?
On this one, people are talking, but people, you know, they're talking about their teams as well, how they've been losing and winning, and how the league stands at the current moment. So, but this tweet says, "Jealous down, Yena, he deserves most of the praise, but I'm not a Sundowns fan. I'll always judge him on his spell at the national team."
And what else have they been saying? Let's take a look at other tweets. What's the next one saying?
I think that was the last tweet.
So that was
the last tweet, Peter.
So Masanda Wana, very excited, very happy.
Very happy, very excited.
Pirates and Chiefs, it's another year.
Yes, yes. And they've been talking about AX Cape Town's future within the league as well. But the last hashtag we on about is hashtag Freedom Day. Freedom Day was on Friday, and we saw the celebrations in Bloemfontein where President Cyril Ramaphosa was speaking the keynote address. So it's still trending this morning, and a lot of topics surrounding Freedom Day have come up. The issue of the land. And the first tweet says, "We just want the land back, not revenge, hashtag Freedom Day." The next one says, "For me personally, Freedom Day means every citizen in this country of ours is free to do whatever they want, hashtag Freedom Day." And then this one says, hashtag Freedom Day. NC did the hard part to get us this far. Now it is time we fight for our economy, dignity, land, and proud of all of through EFF. I stand with what is right at the moment. So, and the next tweet says, "What hashtag Freedom Day do you celebrate where you can't get a job despite experience and qualifications you have unless you pay a bribe or someone who can help you will give you that job?" I take.
And you know, that last tweet I think kind of sums it up for a lot of people in that they're saying, look, we've got the freedom to vote, etc., but it's a challenge when you can't have the freedom to buy what you want because you don't have a job.
The money is to do so. You don't have a house, you don't have employment, yes.
Well, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much indeed for keeping a track on what's happening on social media. Right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we're coming back, we'll continue that conversation we had about community radio. Centec, remember, suspended 15 of the community radio stations, but the suspension was lifted, but it doesn't disappear the issues behind that suspension. Okay, find out more after this. Welcome back. You're watching Media Monitor. Now, you'll remember last week, signal distributor Centec had banned 15 community radio stations, but their suspension was lifted following an agreement by parties involved in the operations of the community radio sector. Well, we're now joined by, in studio, Nduduzi Manana, who's the NCRF president, and Advocate Musa Sishange, who's the acting chairperson from the Media Development and Diversity Agency, the MDDA. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter.
All right, so I'm not even know where to start, but let me start with you, Mr. Manana. More than 108 community radio stations, that's probably half of all of the community radio stations, are struggling financially. They're not paying their Centec fees. And so Centec had to do something. They've been pushed back in terms of the suspensions. But clearly we can't have a situation where the community radio stations are not paying their bills. What is the state of affairs?
Thank you, Peter. Maybe we have to take it back a little bit so that we can understand where we are now. You see, when the community radio was started back in 93 and 94, when it was full force, we continue as community radios who were self-providing in terms of the signal. And then around the 1997, there was a new animal called Y2K that everybody was scared of, that not even computers will just face that thing. So we were all pushed to say, let's go to Centec because Centec is the only service provider that will deal with this particular matter. So we went there, and there were some incentives for going there. One was that we were going to get a subsidy from the government. Two, the equipment that we're going to get will be sustainable and is going to face all of that. So we all went there. All of a sudden, when the number of community radios rose, it then became an issue that the government could not subsidize everyone. And they stopped the subsidy without consulting or even conducting a study to check who will be able to sustain it and who won't be able to sustain it. And then they came in and they charged exuberant prices as Centec, where in rural areas where there are no towers and stuff like that, they went to look for towers with Vodacom, MTN and others. And when they went to install those equipment, they transfer, actually the private sector would charge the government. They will transfer the whole amount to the client, which is the community radio. And that will amount to a 30,000 bill per month, which in a rural area, you are hardly, you hardly make that money.
So earlier on, Councillor Mokhele from ICASA said that the big issue really is mismanagement and not following through with the plans that you presented when you got the license. How much of it is just poor management? The people who are running these stations just can't.
All community radios are established by an Act of Parliament, which ICASA is the regulator. If they've identified the problem, what have they done? Because if they've identified that there was a problem and they need to intervene, they should have called us. We're a structure. It is so bad that we never had a meeting with ICASA where we discussed all of these things. We only hear them making a statement in public. So it's so very wrong. It looks like there's us and them. We are under one sector. We should be talking. When there are challenges, we could come together in one table and resolve those matters.
MDDA, Advocate Sishange, you're there to make sure they succeed. You're there to even fund them. What's happening? It's clear, it appears as if you're unable to do your job. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a sinking ship here.
Again, as you said, maybe we need to just go a step back. The MDDA looks after this sector in a meaningful way. However, our funding, each time we fund a community radio station, is over a period of a year where we do pay their Centec fees, and thereafter they need to be sustainable. So I think there's a structural issue that we need to look at, and that's why we need to go back. So in this relationship that we have with community media and we have with the Department of Communications, the MDDA has met all its obligations from a monetary point of view and a support point of view. However, given the current challenges, we have said we'll meet with the minister, and we have, and we've met with NCRF in a joint meeting where we are trying to resolve this and to see if there are any funds elsewhere just to deal with this emergency issue. However, there's a long-term issue that we need to deal with, the structural problem. And one of our solutions is that we think from a policy point of view, up to, or even more, 30% of government ad spend should actually be on community newspapers, community radio stations, community TVs. We think that if we, at a policy level, from a cabinet level, if that is decided,
so what you're asking is, you're asking taxpayers to fund community radio stations that are not succeeding, that are partly being poorly managed. Why should the taxpayer subsidize community radio?
I don't think that is what we are saying. What we are saying is that government spends an X amount of money, exorbitant amounts of money on all these newspapers, advertising jobs, advertising various departments, advertising their own programs. Where are those programs implemented? At community level. If they do not then advertise on community media, they are not speaking directly to the people that are on the ground. So if there's a closer relationship in that regard, you will find that community media will be sustainable. That is not sidestepping the issues where there are challenges or those that are mismanaged. I think community media is largely very successful. It's the most transformed. it's got the most women ownership, it's got the most youth ownership. They're really, really great success stories. So we need to, in a collective way, try and support them.
All right, gentlemen, this is a conversation I think we're going to have again and continuously. But thank you very much indeed for coming in so early in the morning and sharing with us your thoughts on such an important sector. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, okay, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, freedom of the press. What's the situation in South Africa and the continent?
No. Yes. Yes.
Sports Live every Saturday and Sunday at 7:30 p.m.
Right, you're still watching Media Monitor. Now, this week, Reporters Without Borders released its 2018 World Press Freedom Index, an annual review of 180 countries and their relationship with the media. Now, the report highlights that journalists are a target of a growing wave of authoritarianism, with leaders whipping up against hostility against them. And so let's invite once again Amy and Tracy to chat to us as former journalists and current journalists. South Africa is at number 28. We were lower last year, so it seems as if it's improving, but there are still some challenges. As someone who remembers what it was like before, and as a young woman who's kind of managing in this environment, and I'm going to start by saying, you know, the ruling party is still quite adamant about the appeals tribunal, media appeals tribunal. Do you think that's going to take away from press freedom, or is it going to add to managing responsible media?
I think certainly, I believe that it will take away from press freedom. I think that South Africa enjoys a very self-regulatory system with the Press Council, with the Ombudsman and with the BCCSA. And I think that most media houses have respect for those systems that are in place to help with regulation, that I don't think that we need government interference in what we're doing. Even in the Reporters Without Borders report, it was stated that reporting on the ANC and on topics such as the Guptas and that kind of thing can be problematic for journalists, that they're dissuaded as such from reporting on those topics. So I think if you were to bring in an authoritarian body that was now going to tell us you can and you can't, it would be hugely problematic. All
right, Tracy, I'm going to ask you this question because you're someone who's lived through quite a lot of the history of journalism in this country. I'm concerned about the commercial imperative now. And, you know, it used to be all you could get was a paper, so we could sell loads of them. Now we've moved, and I just wonder if freedom of the press is being curtailed somewhat because you're conscious of getting advertising and not upsetting clients or customers. Have you observed over time that perhaps press freedom's being a bit compromised because of the shrinking money that one can get?
I think it's a very important point, and one must never forget that most media today is a business. It has shareholders, they want profit, And the stories we tell are part of that, a huge mechanism of business models. And I think that's always important for journalists to remember, that as good as their intentions might be and as principled as they might be going into an industry, they are unfortunately a small part in a very big industry. I would like to see, and unfortunately we're operating in difficult times economically, I would like to see more emphasis on training, on internships, because I also believe that journalists are being shortchanged when it comes to their own training, empowering them to be able to be more astute, better journalists. So it's an incredibly controversial topic and very difficult.
All right. Unfortunately, you know, we run out of time so quickly in this program, but thank you so much indeed for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us. And once again, congratulations on your recognition, getting the honor that the President bestowed upon you yesterday. All right, so that's it. That's Media Monitor for this week. It was racy, it was quick, but hopefully we'll have more for you this time next week. So make a date. Have a great long weekend, everybody. Take care.